And to kick us off, I am going to introduce our very first speaker, Dean Jennifer King Rice. Dean Rice is the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Maryland. She's a national expert in education finance and policy, and in her work, she routinely draws on the discipline of economics to explore education policy questions concerning efficiency and equity, and she believes that teachers are a critical resource in the education process. I think these things are really going to inform the conversation you're about to listen in on. It has been an absolute joy for me personally to get to know Dean Rice as well as her colleagues at the College of Education over the past year. Through our work on the coalition, College of Ed is of course one of our co-hosts on this summit today, along with the School of Public Policy. And I am pleased to pass the mic over to Dean Rice.
Thank you so much, Tasman, and good afternoon, everybody. I am just delighted to see you all here. On behalf of the University of Maryland College of Education, I want to welcome you to the summit today. And I just have to say, it is wonderful to see this kind of turnout and level of engagement on these critical issues. Our College of Education has a long-standing commitment to supporting civic education and engagement through our research, our instructional programs, our many community partnerships. We are just deeply committed to expanding access to educational opportunities that empower individuals to fully participate in our civic, democratic, and economic fabric of society. And among our core values is a real dedication to research and practice that transforms education to advance equity and social justice. And civic education, I think we all know, is central to these goals. You know, recent events related to racial injustice and threats to our democracy have just underscored the importance of civic education and service learning. They are perhaps more essential now than they have ever been. Before we dig deep into these issues, I just want to thank some important individuals and groups for their contributions to the summit. You know, all of the members of the Maryland Civic Education Coalition, we as a College of Education are proud to be among the founding members, and we're pleased to co-sponsor this event with the coalition. I specifically want to recognize Sam Novi at the National Conference on Citizenship, and I want to give a shout out back to Tasman and to Jessica Peaker, two people who have worked tirelessly for months to bring this summit to life, and it's great that we're all here together this afternoon. I also want to thank our colleagues, Dean Orr, Paul Brown, Nathan Dietz at the School of Public Policy. We're happy to partner with them on this summit and so many other things at the university. All of today's roundtable moderators and participants. Of course, I can't mention everyone by name, but I do want to recognize Leah Renzi and Julie Ayers from MSDE, who have been leaders and champions for social studies and service learning in our state. And that's really the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. I also want to recognize a couple of colleagues here at the College of Education, Dr. Sarah McGrew, an active member of the Coalition's research working group. And Sarah organized and will be leading the roundtable on media literacy. And Lena Morreale-Scott, last but certainly not least, who will be leading the roundtable on service and project-based learning. And Lena deserves a very special shout out. She leads our college's civic education and engagement initiative, something that means a great deal to me and to the rest of the college. And she has invested countless hours and immeasurable expertise in planning this summit. So thank you, Lena, and thank you all. This summit brings together leaders, researchers, educators from across the state to address issues related to civic education and engagement with a very special focus on equity. We're joined today by members of virtually every school system in our state, as well as nonprofit organizations, legislators, civil rights champions, researchers, higher education, the list goes on and on. So there is a lot of interest in Maryland in these issues. And each one of you brings a really valuable perspective to this conversation. I want you to know that our agenda is structured to facilitate exchanges on where we are in terms of equitable civic education and service learning in Maryland, and really to explore opportunities for how we can do better. So we thought we'd kick off the agenda with a conversation with a really special individual whose distinguished and impactful career embodies a deep and clear commitment to educational equity and the common good. And at the foundation of that, in large part, is civic education. John B. King Jr. is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close educational opportunity and achievement gaps. Dr. King served as U.S. Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. Prior to that role, he carried out the duties of Deputy Secretary, overseeing policies and programs related to P-12 education, English learners, special education, and innovation. He joined the department following his post as New York State Education Commissioner, and he began his career, perhaps most importantly, as a high school social studies teacher and a middle school principal. I am also proud that he serves as a professor of practice in our College of Education, teaching our undergraduate students about controversial issues in education reform. So I want to welcome you, Dr. King, to this conversation.
Thanks.
So let me just, thank you for being here. Let me just start by saying, I think we all know that we are living in an incredibly challenging, rapidly evolving moment in time. The pandemic and its implications for educational equity, ongoing racism and social unrest, economic inequality, threats to democracy. There are good things going on too, but we're facing a lot of challenges. So I just thought I'd start by asking you about your thoughts on the role and importance of civic education in general, but also in this unique moment in time.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this important conversation. And it's great to see so many people passionate about civic education joining this event. During the impeachment, we heard the famous quotation from Ben Franklin quite a bit. To paraphrase, we have a republic if we can keep it. And I would argue civic education has always been central to the preservation of democracy. We can't have a good functioning democracy without strong civic education, without citizens understanding how they can participate and how they can inform their government. That said, this is a particularly challenging moment that reminds us that civic education helps give young people the tools to meet our greatest challenges. We have this extraordinary challenge of COVID and the disproportionate impact that it has had on low-income communities and communities of color from a health perspective. We have this economic crisis around COVID that, again, has had a disproportionate impact on high-needs communities. We're going to have to work our way through navigating the public health consequences, economic consequences. We are seeing today in much of the country the impact of climate change on people's lives. That is a huge challenge, a generational challenge, an existential threat to human existence. And we're going to have to marshal our energies to respond to that. We saw on January 6th a real attack on democracy. And in that insurrection, echoes of dark elements of our history around racism and white supremacy. And so as we navigate through all of these things, we need young people to feel empowered. And we can draw real inspiration from a tradition of young people being the force for social good in our country. You think about John Lewis as a young man being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge as he fought for the right to vote for African Americans. You think about the young people from North Carolina A&T sitting in at lunch counters to protest segregation. So there is this tradition of young people demanding a more just society. We need to draw on that tradition in this moment.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I think you're pulling on so many current events. I think that we've all been witness to over the past year and throughout history, but certainly so many of these things are coming to just the fore over this past year. So there really is I think a special moment in time to really capitalize on and leverage the interest and the passion around these issues. So I want to talk a little bit more about this issue of equity. I think that's very clear in your comments. You have been a leading voice in matters of equity, and I think we both recognize, and it's very clear in your comments, the importance of an equitable education system if we care about realizing a just society. So, let's just put that out front. But how does civic education, from an education perspective, play into that? How do we think about civic education from that equity perspective?
Well, on a number of dimensions. I mean, one is, sadly, as a country, we give the least to the students who need the most. Low-income students and students of color get less access to quality early childhood education, less access to the best prepared teachers, less access to resources, less access to school counselors, less access to advanced coursework. Part of that, sadly, is less access to a well-rounded education, often in districts that are struggling with limited resources. Social studies, science, the arts don't get the same level of prioritization as English and math. There's a narrowing of the curriculum when resources are scarce and teacher professional development preparation are under attended to.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful, we just had in Maryland, the General Assembly override Governor Hogan's very short-sighted veto of the blueprint for Maryland. We've got an opportunity now to see a major new investment in education equity and funding, particularly for our highest needs communities. So I'm hopeful of the direction we're headed in Maryland, but one of the equity challenges is kids just not getting civic education, too little attention to social studies. A second equity challenge is that we aren't always honest as a country about the hard parts of our history, and that has real implications for students' readiness to navigate a diverse world. My great-grandfather was enslaved about 25 miles from where I'm sitting. I'm sitting in Silver Spring, Maryland. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg. That history is not far from us. The cabin where he was enslaved still standing on the property. The property is still owned by the family that owned my family. That history of slavery and the segregation that followed, the racial wealth gap, those are all extensions of painful parts of the true story of America. And too often we don't address that in the curriculum, and then students aren't prepared to grapple with how we build a just, racially diverse democracy. And then a third element around equity is access to the strongest teachers and the most diverse teachers. One of the challenges we have as a country, majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. So too often, kids don't get to see diverse adults. And that's a problem because we know from research evidence that kids of color can achieve at higher levels, graduate from high school at higher levels, go on to college at higher levels, if they have just at least one teacher of color.
Yeah.
But it matters for all kids. I think it's important for white kids to see diverse educators teaching and leading in their classrooms. And that too is a part of civic education. So we can't narrow civic education just to sort of social studies, history, content, the mechanics of how a bill becomes a law. Civic education has to really be about readiness to participate in our civic discourse as a society.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for those comments. And that issue about the diversity of the teaching workforce is something as a College of Education that we are really focused on. How do we recruit and prepare diverse, equity-minded educators for this next generation? And you're absolutely right. I mean, some of our own faculty are doing that research that shows how important it is to have diverse educators for all students. So it is a challenge, and we need to think really hard about how to invest resources to make that happen. So I absolutely agree. And I also want to put a plug in for the Washington Post article that featured Dr. King's family and going back to where his family, his ancestors were enslaved. If you haven't read that, you should absolutely track it down. It is just a powerful, powerful piece that really brings that history to light. So thank you again for that piece. And I'll try to dig out the link and share it in the chat as I get a moment. So looking forward, I have to believe there is hope. But in the midst of that, there's a lot of talk about getting back to normal. Here comes the vaccine, we're getting back to normal. And I think, John, you and I both agree that back is not really where we want to be going. There were a lot of problems with back to normal, and there's a huge opportunity to leverage some of what we've learned during these challenging times to define a new normal and what that looks like, one that's more equitable, one that's more inclusive, one that addresses the kinds of things that you talked about. that really leads us to a situation where we have education systems that enable individuals to have the opportunity to fully participate. So, looking forward, how do you think about, how we might better prepare the next generation of global citizens for more meaningful and informed civic engagement, to be those global citizens that, that we'd like to be cultivating?
Well, I hope that we've had this realization now, how fragile our democratic institutions are. And I hope what that causes us to do is a few things. One, to really take seriously that social studies needs time and attention. We have to ensure that elementary school teachers get good preparation for teaching social studies. We got to make sure that elementary school principals and school districts emphasize that social studies has to be a part of the elementary school experience. And then we've got to provide good professional development for our middle school and high school teachers, not only around teaching social studies, but how do we integrate social studies in important ways with what students are learning in English language arts or in science or in math. Then we've got to tackle this question of sort of more fully centering racial equity in our curriculum and instruction. Are we in our English language arts classes exposing students to diverse authors and diverse stories? Are they seeing representations of themselves and of people who are different from them, windows and mirrors, if you will? When President Obama gave his final address as president in Chicago, he used as an example of what we need in this country, a quote from To Kill a Mockingbird about how you never really understand the world from someone else's perspective until you've walked in their skin, essentially. And it was about this idea of perspective taking, right? And that's a skill that we can teach, an important skill of citizenship, to be able to think about a problem from someone else's experience. So I hope we'll make that shift. I hope that we will come out of this period more committed to closing equity gaps around fundamental, foundational skills like reading and writing. Because the reality is you're going to have a hard time appreciating the founding documents if you are a struggling reader. Right? We've got to give you that strong foundation to have that access. And too often we see huge gaps for our students of color, for our low-income students, for our English learners, for our students with disabilities in getting those foundational literacy skills. So that's also got to be a part of our vision for civic education. And then I'd say lastly, how do we give kids opportunities to be active citizens? How do we create opportunities through service learning, through hands-on projects? How do we create opportunities for kids to participate in the political process? How do we create opportunities for students to convey their concerns to their school board? Right? I'm hopeful that we will see more young people demanding of their school board that they have a plan to phase out fossil fuels and move to renewable energy. I hope we will see more students organizing to say, why do we have discipline disparities in our school district where African-American students are disproportionately suspended? We did a report at Ed Trust that showed in many places around the country, African-American girls are 5 times as likely as white female students to be suspended from school. I want to see young people showing up at school board meetings asking, why is that? What are we doing about it? How are we shifting towards restorative justice? How are we increasing investments in counselors and mental health services? How are we tackling implicit bias in our school district? So I want us to have a vision of civic education that isn't just about kids taking in content, but really equipping them with skills and then giving them opportunities to apply those skills. All of that is possible if we see this as a moment, as you say, to not just go back to February 2020, but actually to build a more just future.
Yeah. And I think as you're describing it, it really resonates with me. One of the questions I had for you, and I think you've answered it, was that notion, and I know you were a social studies teacher, and so I thank you for that, but this has to be work beyond social studies teachers. This has to be work that we're all embracing, teachers from across the curriculum, counselors and support staff, administrators, parents, but making those opportunities to be engaged for all students, not just some students who will then go on to be engaged as adults. Those disparities I think are palpable as well. So Yeah, I really appreciate that point as well. So I think we're closing in on our time. John, is there anything else you'd like to add on the topic before we move into the next segment of the agenda?
Yeah, just two quick observations. I mean, one is it's so great to see people from all over the state a part of this conversation. And I think one of our challenges as a state is, too often people will pit parts of the state against each other, blame problems on a particular part of the state. They'll say, well, we have that problem because that's a Baltimore problem, or that's an Eastern Shore problem, or that's a Western Maryland problem. And so it's nice to see everybody in one conversation, because we actually have to cultivate students as citizens, yes, of the United States, citizens, yes, of their community, but also as citizens of one Maryland, where our state, our future, our futures are bound up together. We all have a stake in each other's future. And we have to think about the rest of the state as our neighbors and fellow citizens as we tackle big challenges. The other thing that's really encouraging to see as I look across this call is that this is a multi-generational conversation. And we have to do more, I think, to put students in the driver's seat of this conversation. I think about last year during the protests after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, standing with my daughters in front of the White House on the steps of St. John's Church, demanding attention to the idea that Black Lives Matter, demanding that we reform policing and criminal justice. And it is happening slowly, but because of the organizing of young people and then the mobilization of a multi-generational movement, we are seeing real efforts to reform policing and criminal justice. So we've got to build a multi-generational commitment to civic education and civic experiences, and we've got to raise student voice as we do that.
Yeah, thank you. So I just have to say, I always appreciate your leadership, your perspectives, your wisdom. And I always learn so much from our conversations, whether the formal ones or the informal ones. And today is no exception. So thank you so much, John, for being here. Thank you for your leadership in the state and across the nation. You and your team at the Education Trust is doing a phenomenal job. And we are just really grateful for all you're doing in the name of equity and education. So thank you.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the partnership in this work and for your leadership, not only at the College of Education, but really across the University of Maryland system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Thank you both so much for that conversation. I saw a great chat happening both on Twitter and also in our chat boxes. And I'm personally not sure whether I should hold up the thank you or the snaps at the end of that. I'm now so pleased to introduce one more speaker in our opening, and that is Delegate Eric Luedtke, who is the majority leader of the Maryland House of Delegates and a career educator. He's a lifelong Marylander, a former high school social studies teacher, and currently a clinical professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, who of course is one of our co-hosts for today's summit. Delegate.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me. It's hard to follow on Dean Rice and Secretary King, but I do want to emphasize some of the things they said because I think they're important for all of us to understand. This work that you're doing, that you're engaged in at this conference, is more important than ever. We're at a crucial moment for democracy in America. And, you know, I was a history teacher, as was just said, and so I try to draw historical parallels. And I'm going to engage in some gross generalizations here. I think every generation of Americans has confronted a moment where the survival of our democracy was on the line, right? I mean, the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Jim Crow and the reaction to it in the Civil Rights Movement, McCarthyism. Every generation has faced challenges to democracy, and we're facing them again in our time. And every generation has thought they were the first generation to face challenges to democracy. But it turns out this is a consistent pattern. And Americans throughout history have stepped up and said, no, we believe in our democratic system. We believe in the health of our civic society. We believe in building a better future for our kids by building those institutions. I think every generation also has recognized the importance of education in sustaining democracy, right? That goes all the way back to the founders, although of course the founders had a skewed idea of what it meant to engage in civics education. They thought it meant learning ancient Greek, and they thought that only people that looked like me should be able to participate. And we've long since moved past both of those ideas. But the reality is that unless we get civics education right in our generation, it's unclear what the next generation of America will look like. And that's a heavy load to carry. That's a heavy weight on our shoulders, but it's a weight that I think we can bear. When I was a social studies teacher, I came up through the No Child Left Behind era. And those of you who were in the classroom at the time know what that meant, particularly as a social studies teacher. I was passionate about civics. I was passionate about government. I was passionate about teaching history. And I was told in my second year of teaching that I was no longer a social studies teacher. I was a reading teacher because that was the only subject that was tested and it was the only subject that mattered. And we lost an opportunity for years with our students to provide them the type of civic education that they deserve. Not only do we need to bring that back, not only do we need to do a better job providing the type of civics education we should have been providing throughout the No Child Left Behind era, but we need to go beyond. It's become fashionable now in education to talk about apprenticeships, right? And to build out apprenticeships in our schools. We need democracy apprenticeships for every single child that graduates from an American high school. We need every single one of them to know what it means to participate in a society, to be given opportunities to participate, to be taught that it's okay to have a difference of opinion, that it's okay to protest. And you're seeing those types of conversations in our public buildings right now. In Annapolis, we've been debating, we had a proposal to cut back on students' ability to participate in educational decision-making. And we beat that back. And we're having conversations now about how to expand it. We have a bill that was introduced this year to make clear the rights that students have to engage in protest in the schools. The House of Delegates is about to pass the Student and Military Voter Empowerment Act, which will, among other things, make sure college students receive basic information about how to participate in democracy. We need to keep that work going. And to Secretary King's point that he closed with, this is not a work that's isolated to one part of the state, to one community. It's work that involves us all together. And to his point about One Maryland, I think one of the best things that's happened for democracy in Maryland in recent years was just announced yesterday that a businessman based in Montgomery County has helped to fund a nonprofit which will purchase and continue to run the Baltimore Sun, the primary news source on Maryland politics since the 1830s, right? That institution is powerful. It's so vital that it survives. And it was a Montgomery County resident that helped maintain that Baltimore City institution, and it's good for all of us. And we need more of that. So thank you to each of you for the work you're doing, for participating in this summit, for the work you're going to be doing over the next few years. We've got a lot of work to do to strengthen democracy in this country. And I'm really excited to be walking that path with each and every one of you.
Thank you so much, Delegate Luedtke. And with that, we are going to close our opening session and move straight into our roundtable discussions.